You are in Integrating Sheep and Vineyards, Compelling Data and Lessons Learned. So we have a panel of vineyard managers, grazers, and researchers that are going to be sharing some stories and science and data, as well as just kind of like on the ground practical tips if integrating sheep into your vineyards is something you're interested in. So I'm going to just start by asking everyone to just take a quick moment to introduce yourselves, tell us who you are, where you're calling in from, your title, as that may pertain to this workshop, and then we'll get started with some conversation. So I'll start with you, Christian Cain.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. So I am here representing Perennial Grazing, which is a ecological services company. So we use small ruminants, sheep and goats, only sheep in the vineyards, to provide ecological services. Um, there's kind of three main pillars of kind of the work we focus on. Kind of, I'll say them kind of as they come around in the year sequentially. So the year starts out with perennial crop systems, which Vineyards is a part of. And then the second springtime, early summer is targeted ecological grazing. And then kind of the new the summer into the fall is like fire safety work, fuel road management, vegetation management. But yeah, like I said, today is about vineyard grazing, and so yeah, sheep only in the vineyards, and I guess I'll save some of the detail on that for as we get into it. But yeah, I started this endeavor, this company, very optimistically 10 years ago this fall. Yeah, and then this year we're running about 2,000 head of sheep, 2,200 between three different sites. And so yeah, it's a big partnership between the sheep, the land, the people on my team, shepherds, herders, herding dogs, guard dogs, all the soil life that breaks down the manure, and then of course the vineyard owners, vineyard managers, winemakers that we're working with.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, lots of moving parts in this kind of work.
Yeah.
Charlie, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your operation?
Hi, my name is Charlie Hamilton. My background, I grew up on a sheep and cattle ranch, fifth generation out of Solano County. So, running livestock is I got used to as an early age. My current day job is running a vineyard management company through Solano, Sacramento, and the Lodi area. We cover about 3,200 acres. But then on the side, my wife and I farm 50 acres. That's where we met Tommy. And we had been consistently grazing for over the last 10 years on this site, going from conventional integrating sheep to moving to more no herbicide programs. So kind of the gamut of working with sheep. And we currently run on the management side, we graze about 2,000 acres every year within our conventional and organic vineyards. So, yeah, I'm excited for today and can't wait for the discussion.
Great, thanks, Charlie. And Kristen, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. And I'm Kristin Belair. I currently am the Director of Winegrowing and Sustainability at Honig Vineyard and Winery, and was winemaker here from 1998 to 2023. So kind of shifting gears a little bit. We have been grazing sheep here now for 4 years and work in conjunction with our vineyard management company, who is also, we're also working in conjunction with our neighbors to make it economically feasible. So apparently moving sheep around is the most expensive part of the business. And Tommy, we were also a site for some of Tommy's work, and have made, later on I'll share some observations that we have seen and little tweaks we've done in the vineyard to make it even more feasible.
Awesome, thanks. And then Tommy, everyone has mentioned you pretty much, and so why don't you introduce yourself so we can wrap this together?
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Tommy Fenster. I'm a researcher with the Gaudin Agroecology Lab at UC Davis, as well as the Ecdysis Foundation. wrapping up my PhD this June, but my PhD research in this project focused on looking at the effect of grazing and how it interacts with other regenerative management practices or potentially lack thereof to affect soil health, biodiversity, input usage. And as part of that research, had a great opportunity to work with the folks here as well as a number of other vineyards. And so we have sites that were grazed by Kristin and yeah, and then took data from Charlie and Kristin's sites. So it's be fun to share that data and kind of what all these folks here are achieving in their work. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, and just a note too to kind of make it all make sense of why we're doing this and why CAFF is involved. CAFF was a part of the research project that Tommy has been a part of, thanks to funding from the WSARE grant. So part of that is that I worked in collaboration with several others to create a grazing guide, which I just dropped into the chat, and it will also be included in any follow-up emails that go out. So if you miss it right now, that's fine. But basically trying to take the information or basically like the lessons learned of the people that were on the ground doing the work and then combining that with some of the research that Tommy has done to create a really practical guide of how you can start to take small steps to integrate sheep into vineyards if that feels like a good method for you to be integrating into your operation. So that was kind of one of like my personal outcome of this work, and got to interview all of the people that are on this panel, and that's how I got to meet them. And so yeah, it's fun to be reconnecting and sharing all that information with you all. So some of this, I'm going to ask some questions, and it might feel like I need to tweak it a little bit for Kristin, and then also for Charlie. You have two hats, right? You run a grazing operation, and you also own a vineyard, so you can kind of speak to both sides of it. But wanted to start with maybe I'll start with you, Kristin, about why at Honig you all chose to start grazing to begin with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we've seen people grazing at various places around the valley for I don't know how many years now, but typically it just hasn't been economically feasible. But our vineyard management company, Kalina's Farming, also farms some other vineyards locally and was able to put enough landowners together to have enough acres close by to make it make sense from an economic standpoint. So the cost is about the same or less than a tractor pass. And so we started doing that about I think it's like been 4 seasons now, and has been quite successful. And also the number of acres locally in Rutherford has expanded in terms of how many people are grazing and how many acres. So, I mean, and the other thing, of course, is just that the attraction of being, economically and environmentally sustainable. I mean, those two things came together, and having visitors here at the winery and they see the sheep and they think it's super cool. So,
Yeah, definitely. That the cuteness factor is definitely a piece for a lot of people as far as from like the consumer standpoint. So when you guys first chose to integrate sheep, would you say it was more of an economic choice or more of a sustainability choice? Like what was the driver?
I don't know that we can really separate that, but
Okay.
I think having it. I mean, I've heard costs for grazing as high as $400 an acre, which just that for us, that's just not economically feasible, no matter how cute those sheep are. But having it come down to a lower, to a more economically feasible price definitely made it attractive and bookable. And we have been herbicide free for well over 10 years, and are starting to get everything under 100% permanent cover, so even under vine. So having the sheep be able to graze, especially under vine, just that saves that extra tractor cost.
Got it. And what about you, Charlie?
So I wore a couple different hats. So when we first got started, on my personal vineyard, my wife and I have our own label, Pressley Vineyards, and it was kind of like this natural morphine for the market that we were trying to sell into, and then kind of the story, that we had. It, the herd is naturally on the ranch, so moving it from one paddock, you're literally opening up the gate and we move them right on in. So it was a natural symbiotic relationship within that, to start bringing them in and to morph it, um, to bring it into no herbicides. And I think with like what Kristin said, it has to be a balance of both, because like on my other hat, I wear it for vineyard management, and it had to make economic sense for us to bring it in based on the price point and of the areas that we're farming in within the Lodi Delta region. And so you had to prove that, hey, this makes sense on scale, to bring the sheep in to provide a vegetated. We clean up after harvest on a lot of our vegetation, and let that go into the fall. And we've seen just our natural vineyard floors really improve, moving away from a lot more broadleaves that we saw on our floors to our natural grasses and getting it back to more of a native, um, grassland. And so, yeah, I think it coming from both sides, on my family having sheep and us hiring contract grazers, was you needing to have a balance of both. Everybody needs to be able to find a solid working relationship, but economics is huge. If like Kristin said, the cuteness factor pushes out pretty quickly if it's doesn't make sense economically. Um, and so I think that's where we truly gain sustainability in all those pillars, when we're connecting all of it, the economics, the environmental, and the land stewardship. So
Great, thanks. And Christian, can you speak to how, as someone who is grazing, and you mentioned you're mostly in vineyards in the winter time, like how that conversation goes with producers when you're trying to figure out contracts and you're trying to, I know when we spoke, when I interviewed you a year and a half ago, or whenever that was, you made some great comments about like the goals and like having to really listen to the goals of the grower. So can you speak to that a little bit from the grazing perspective, as the person who's coming in as kind of like an outsider, to facilitate some change on a piece of land?
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd say that I hear four, kind of maybe four and a half, five different goals or kind of motivations that lead vineyard managers to call and want to hire in the sheep, partner on that work. Um, One would be, yeah, soil benefit, mostly using the sheep as a alternative method to mechanical cutting for integrating, especially commercial, especially planted cover crops back into the soil. Um, and there's some really great. I'm so thankful that the Gaudin lab and Kelsey Brewer and Amelie Gaudin had done some really great long-term, I think 8 year side-by-side studies with really solid methodology that came out at the end of 23, showing the soil health benefits of just even side-by-side of growing organic cover crop on both sides of that, of that experiment line and control line, and then mowing versus grazing. And they showed some, a lot of really great benefits there. And there's some nuance to it. And we can talk about the details of that. But yeah, so soil health, being one of them, labor saving being another, if labor's scarce that time of year. And for some people, it totally isn't. For some people, they say, hey, we've got a year-round crew and we're kind of looking for a project for them. So it might not be a good fit. But for some people, there is problems with labor scarcity. So there's that. Bringing down the vegetation level also helps address frost damage issues. And so that's three. The four would be, yeah, very kind of situational, but many times it can be money saving. And then I guess you call it the fifth would be with more kind of feel like we're all seeing more extreme weather events, especially like big storms around in February, March, the time of year when the vineyards want to start getting tractors in the field. You can't get tractors in the field, especially heavily tilled areas, because of the sink into the mud tractors. So then the sheep can be working then, and especially not getting, especially development block, they call, of like young vines that were just planted the previous year or the previous fall. Then the sheep can get in and kind of not let the weeds totally swallow those up at a time of year or soil conditions where the tractors couldn't get in. So, yeah, so I'd say those are kind of, yeah, I'd say the five reasons that I see people reaching out. And, like you say, I definitely try to always be present to the people in front of me and the land I'm on, and what their goals are in particular, because everybody is kind of their own balance of those five.
Yeah, great. Tommy, can you speak at all to first of all, if you can give a little overview? I know you're going to do a presentation later, but of how many vineyards you were working with your study, and then was there like a clear line of like, we're trying to transition to organic, or were there drivers from that perspective that were kind of leading some of the growers you were working with, or was it all over the board?
That's a great question. So we worked at 49 sites across the Northern California and the Central Coast. And so I'm trying to, and part of it, it was kind of across the board of how folks were using grazing, but you did see a number of folks who weren't necessarily organic or had the goal of organic certification, but saw the sheep as a key tool to being able to move away from herbicides as well as mowing events. And I think those motivations are pretty reflective of what uh, Charlie and Kristin said, in which, it's makes a lot of economic sense as well too, especially some folks who have a higher trellising system, so they can pretty much, pretty large operations where before they may to do some in-season herbicide application or some pre-emergent, but then allowing to have, four grazing events through the year, including, post-harvest to really allow that, a lot of nice cost savings and then some of these other sustainability benefits as well too. But it's also a key part of folks' organic programs as well too. If you're grazing, folks who are organic, maybe they don't have herbicide as a tool, it does allow them to begin moving away from tillage or mowing as a way to manage that ground cover and kind of get the release of that nutrients as well. So it's kind of a cool, neat tool that works for folks who are both organic and non-organic to enhance their sustainability.
Great, thanks. And just wanted to remind folks, I see a couple of things popping up. If you have questions, you can drop it into the Q&A, and we're going to try to leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end for like more interactive Q&A. So if there's stuff that we're not covering while we're chatting right now, please drop questions into the Q&A and we'll address that towards the end. Oh, where was I going there? Okay, so we've talked a bit. So there's kind of this balance of like economic and ecological impacts and goals. I'm curious if, for all of you, if anyone saw something surprising or like a standout after, let's say, anywhere from like 1 to 4 years of grazing to be like, oh, wow, like I didn't expect that to happen. I mean, Charlie, you kind of mentioned like more natives coming back in. Curious if you sow cover crops or if you're just grazing resident vegetation. But yeah, just any of those kinds of things that were kind of like a bonus, I guess you could say, above and beyond what you were already expecting.
Um, so, we used to, I think at the time when Tommy was doing, we were tilling every other row, every other year. And we've moved away from it just being the full permanent, or I say permanent, but it's just natural vegetation. Because we've shifted to mean, where we can have the real high heat spikes, we're trying to have a thatch develop. And so we would sow a cover crop that would have, like an oats, or a quickly receding or growing grass, to kind of like, all right, how do we want to prep that our our floor, that's something after we come in and graze it early season in the spring, right prior to bread break, that there's enough soil moisture to allow for that plant to regrow and set seeds, because we want that to, like, whatever you're doing, we want to promote a long-term reseeding seed bank that will outcompete some of our more noxious broadleaves. And that's where we've seen in rows, in the row that we've had the longest, it is the most uniform on just the natural grass. And like you'll see it moves away from Malva or any other species.
Uh-oh.
We've seen it's more of it matches the native hills that we farm in. And I think whatever weed seed or whatever seeds you augment in, your natural environment will start to take over, because that seed bank just naturally is huge.
Great. Anybody else? Any kind of surprise things that you noticed, whether positive or negative, I guess you could say?
Hi. I don't know if this is necessarily a positive or negative, but I was speaking with another local vineyard manager, and he mentioned that they had looked at the what weeds were in the vineyard and saw a shift to slightly different weeds. So that's just probably something for an individual site to look at. Our goal is to have a permanent cover, which is that's mostly grasses, but of course there's native vegetation, whatever, and weeds that are around are in there as well. But with the grazing, especially in the mature blocks, once it's grazed a couple times, it doesn't seem to really need to be mowed, maybe once over the season. And like Kristin was saying earlier, you can, if you need to get a tractor in there, you can, if you have a permanent cover, a thatch or permanent cover. Whereas if it's just up, you can't.
Hmm.
And I mean, we also have had to, with young, newly planted vines that are sort of buried over the winter, we can't run sheep in there because they tend to pull the vines up. So that's been a little bit of a shift for us. And we also run a drip line higher. It's about 36 inches high. So we have a high trellis system. That way they go under the drip system instead of through it.
Got it. Kristin or Tommy, any surprising findings?
Say that I'm such a zealot about seeing all the soil benefits that I wouldn't call that surprising. But one part of, getting into this working in Athens, Sonoma, that you didn't see coming was how much it's kind of brought neighbors together, and how much, I think these kind of biological solutions point us to work beyond fence lines. And so just like Kristin was saying, like a lot of times, like always, we'll be working with groups of neighbors because then we can offer everybody a lower price. And a lot of times on those days of walking the street between two different vineyard properties, that actually have seen vineyard managers meet for the first time, meet neighboring vineyard managers to start to collaborate. And yeah, that's a part of it I didn't really see coming, but has been very encouraging to me.
Yeah, I think that was one thing that really stuck out when I was writing the guide, is like kind of like a larger sustainability, right? Like the sustainability, like not only from a soil perspective or also the economics of an operation, but a community, like a community-wide sense of sustainability of people getting to know each other, especially when it comes to, what you mentioned, Kristin, like grazing for fire fuel management, like all of those things. And in this state, that's so essential for people to be able to talk to each other and to be looking at kind of the larger ecosystem and the effects that that this kind of practice can have. Kristin, do you want to speak to that at all? Or Charlie? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's, you do see a little bit more working together, especially if you're bringing in a contract grazer or something, and say we have a smaller block where you're you talk to your neighbor, hey, would you be interested? And it goes from, yeah, I'll try it this year to next year, like, hey, when's that herd going to show back up? So there's definitely been some positivity in that community aspect. One thing that Kristin brought up from Honig, that the great idea of making sure we talk on the trellis systems, like she was saying that they brought it up to 36 inches. Like that is a huge aspect on running sheep, and making sure we don't drop our catch wires too early before the sheep come in, or making sure you have your higher drip zones, just for better stewardship of the livestock that's in there in that environment. Because sometimes as viticulturists, vineyard managers, we think, oh, we have to do X, Y, and Z to get this done for the vine, but we have to make sure that we're bringing in that thought process to help the herd that's going to be going through, that their legs don't get caught up, or that the drip hose is well maintained, all those little things and aspects that go a long ways to better integration.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments on that before we move to the next question?
Sure. On I think the neighbor to neighbor aspect is really important. We are part of a local vineyard management neighborhood. We call it a neighborhood group, Rutherford Central. And we've actually been meeting for probably over 10 years. But having people getting together and sharing their experiences has actually brought more people into grazing locally. So it's definitely that the personal contact really helps it makes it less expensive and just brings a lot of positive things to the neighborhood.
Awesome. I'm curious if you all could speak to some of the challenges you faced, particularly when starting out, and Kristin, for you too, as a new business owner. What were, like you guys mentioned, at what height is the drip line? I know there's lots of different ways that vineyards can be set up, that some are a little bit more conducive to grazing, some make it a little bit more challenging. You've got issues depending on your growing practices of like spraying, whether it's herbicides or copper or whatever, and just how do you manage all of those pieces when there's a lot of different people? You've got possibly a contract grazer, or you've got a vineyard manager, you've got like the people that are literally working in the fields on the day-to-day, right? So there's a lot of pieces, plus then you got animals. So yeah, thinking if we could just touch for a few minutes on some of the challenges you faced. Whoever wants to jump in.
I think some of the challenges that we experienced was talking about, like, first to start with, like the infrastructures, making sure that's all well maintained. Like coming out of harvest from sites that are handpicked to sites that are machined, is making sure that the vineyard is, we go through the vineyard and make sure there's no obstacles that a sheep could get caught with, or there's, we're making sure everything's safe before that herd comes in. And making sure drip line maintenance, that's, at a certain height, or really tight. If it's, was conventionally installed, not before we thought about having sheep, most of those drip lines were sitting at 18 inches. Well, the sheep are going to try to jump over it. Well, in that aspect, make sure that it's tight onto that drip wire, so it's not an extra thing that they could get caught on. Their legs could go in between the drip hose and the wire. And then making sure the right height on the cordon, especially if you're doing spring grazing, like we found to be at like 42 inches with a ewe, which a ewe is, an older sheep, versus a yearling lamb is a lower statured sheep. And those start to make a difference in the trellising height and how you manage that. One other aspect is, on certain ranches, where we had to understand where we're going to position water for the herd to come in. So it's having to take more of that holistic approach on how do we provide a safer environment for them. And then, also what's the feed value? Like if you bring them in the fall, we bring it in and try to bring it right after harvest on our taller vineyards, but there's still green matter for them to eat. And they're, the digestible nutrients, your TDNs are still high. And that's especially like when we went to dealing with crabgrass or Bermuda grass, you have to start them early versus late, where you've gotten a fall of frost. So those are small little things we've learned.
Yeah, a lot of fine details to manage. Kristin or Christian, any challenges when you were first starting out?
Yeah, I'd say that. I mean, didn't come from like a ranching animal husbandry background or family. So it's kind of got obsessed with this and kind of deeply ensnared by it. It's kind of been a huge, challenging learning curve. The challenges are pretty endless. Um, uh, yeah, I don't even know where to begin. Of like, I think that like learning veterinary, diesel mechanics, finance, financial literacy, soil health, plant life cycles, all these things at the same time. It's just a huge learning curve. So that's challenging. Yeah, more recently, like, the labor piece is definitely a huge challenge, and just people who were interested in this work, have the skills for this work, have the aptitude for it. Um, and like a lot of, regulatory things there. And then, but one thing I kind of put on the other side of the scale is, I think it was 2019, when I was starting to offer, kind of go bigger scale with offering the grazing service like this. And then I hired a bunch of vineyard management companies, some big ones like Atlas, but a lot of ones that were more around Napa than Sonoma. But and I asked about what they thought of vineyard grazing and if there was basically the demand versus the supply. If there was still like a lot of people that were interested, that maybe like would want another grazer in town. And then they pretty much all told me like, oh, you know what? Like everybody tried that like 10 years ago, and nobody really wants to do it. Nobody's interested in that. And I was like, oh, okay. And I still like spent my birthday that year, like passing out, visiting, like a list I had of all these organic wineries in Napa and passing out flyers and probably not getting to the right person and not really getting any calls from it. But anyways, then just, yeah, kind of like the 2 years later, it just felt like it was, this started this really big climb in interest in the grazing. And so, just to counterweigh against the challenges, it felt like, I felt very kind of grateful to be like, just good timing of kind of starting to offer this as a service at scale at the same time that the interest in it is really growing and growing.
Anybody else? I know some of the things that came up when I was interviewing other folks, just on like a practical scale, is things like, and you kind of spoke to this a little bit, Charlie, about like having where you're going to have water, depending on what time of year you're bringing them in, like having a large enough space for a trailer to come in and be able to like turn around, right? Some of those like really basic things that can make it more challenging for a smaller scale operation if they don't have just the literal land base. Um, yeah. Any other stuff folks want to touch on around that?
Yeah, I'd say just to anybody that's kind of considering bringing the grazing on in like the form that I do is for like commercial scale operations, like yeah, all we really are requesting from the vineyard is just like a water, like a regular hose tap, and then like a one, just regular wall plug, 110-volt power source. And then most of the time we've got a person on site and like a travel trailer, kind of a camper trailer. So it's like 20, 24 foot, 25 foot. So a space for that is also necessary. And then, yeah, like you said, kind of most of the time now that people are coming on like 18 wheelers. So kind of, yeah, can they pull in there? Do we have to unload it on the road or walk them in? Is there a space that we can set up our portable corral at the end? fill them up. These are all kind of the considerations. But yeah, that's all we really need from the vineyard side. And then anybody that's kind of thinking about doing it smaller scale, I would just note that in my experience, I think there's a really big shift that happens when you get a density of 80 or more heads of 80 or more sheep per acre, in that they kind of click over a different gear in their head and kind of get less selective about what they're eating because there's more of a bird, there's more of a competition. And so then you're able to get a way more even kind of result product of the grazing because then you kind of activate a little bit of a different mentality than how you can kind of get the grazing. So just for folks, who have maybe tried it and did you consider or tried it with just like, 30 sheep over 12 acres for a couple of weeks, it's really yeah, it's kind of a pretty different thing than once if you're able to get, yeah, like I say, at least kind of 80 or 100 per acre. And if that means you only have 50, then maybe that just means you give them a half acre or something time and do it rotation. Then we do the that fencing. Um, but just kind of some thoughts there to help folks kind of picture, what might be the success with it.
Charlie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'd agree with Kristin on we found on some of our larger ranches on some of the paddocks they'll build is about 25 seems to be a decent number, but it seems like the speed and what Kristin was saying is like there's the mob grazing is important because the sheep is selective. It's just like you and I, as you have your favorite food, I have my favorite food, and it's the same things. Some weeds are or some species of plants are more delicious than others to a sheep, and and being able to move those along, opening up paddocks is really important on cycling through that ground, not overgrazing, but grazing up enough. We've seen that to be pretty successful. And yeah, I think it's important with the having enough space for trailers and having for the herders that are on site, a good location for the guy. It's because it's not cost effective if he has to drive down the road to check it. Like I remember as a kid, sheep getting out on the road, like those things happen, sheep get out. And so like being able to understand that, it's sheep sometimes don't do what you want them to do. And so they'll get out. And so having someone on site and having that ability for that herder to be there and act within a short period of time is important. So
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. All right. Well, to wrap up our panel, we've got a few minutes left before we pass it over to Tommy. I am just curious if you all had advice or pointers. We've kind of started to allude to this from like the really logistical standpoint of like having a place for a trailer to get set up or having a place for, water, power, all of those things. But what is some advice you might offer to someone who's thinking about integrating sheep for the first time?
Um, I would add on just like have a contact phone number for your shepherd, or because like Charlie was saying, the sheep do get out. Sometimes they like to go for a little wander, and like we have coyotes here, so they need to get back in where the guard dogs are relatively quickly. And I mean, from our experience, the grazing, they with I don't know what our herd density is, but it looks like a really nicely mowed lawn pretty much when they're done. And the things they don't eat sometimes are like if it's mustard, if they're really tall, they'll eat all the leaves off the stalks, but then leave the stalk. So, but yeah, having a contact phone number for if there's any concerns that come up, yes, important.
Right. And I know, Kristin, when we spoke out at the Vineyard, that was something you mentioned is like having a new perspective of like the aesthetic, right? And especially because you're in Napa Valley, there historically, at least what you were explaining is like there was historically a very clear aesthetic of the vineyard floor being very clean. And so
Right.
what you're alluding to is like that is not necessarily what you're going to get.
Well, I think that aesthetic is changing actually.
Okay.
Um, it's over the last couple of decades, that sort of clean disc vineyard isn't what people expect anymore. In fact, that's pretty rare anymore. And people are expecting to see a high cover crop and lots of green on the vineyard floor.
I think to add what Kristin's saying is like one of the things that we've seen or I've seen like problems, right, is not having the communication with your grazer. Like I think for your first time, people think, oh, let's put them in before bud break, and then bud break shows up and everybody freaks out and wants the herd to be moved out rapidly. Like it's not fair for that grazer who just moved in to quickly have to shuttle out. So I think we have to make sure there's expectations set. Like it's going to take you so long to get through that tall cover crop. It's going to take 2 to 3 weeks of getting through it and making sure, do you have enough time? Or maybe this is something that you should come in next year because you're going to get in for a week and then have to move them out real quickly. So having that forethought on how long it's going to take you to get through that operation is going to be important.
Yeah, for sure. Kristin, anything from the contract grazer perspective you want folks to know about or think about?
Yeah, I think that just to jump in and it should be hopefully it's a joyful thing, especially if you can kind of do it small scale and really be involved. Just if you are small scale, I think that's a great thing. But I'd like to kind of speak to a couple of questions in the Q&A. You want
We can we'll save that
idea?
for the end. We'll do Q&A at
Okay.
the end. But yeah, so keep popping your questions in there. And yeah, I think we'll wrap up the panel portion and hand it over to Tommy, who is going to share his screen and talk with us about his research.
All right. Awesome. Can everyone see it all right?
I'm not seeing it yet, Tommy. Oh, there it is. Got it.
You got it? Okay. Great. All right, awesome. So I will let's see. Let me just get a timer going. I'll keep it pretty quick, about 10 minutes. Is that correct, Layla? All right, we'll go on that. No. Great. Okay, so going to speak about research looking at how grazing interacts with regenerative management on vineyards across the California vineyards and how this can enhance the delivery of ecosystem services. Awesome. Let's see. Here we go. So what we did? So we did this research on 49 commercial vineyards. We essentially set up this study to look at vineyards with and without sheep grazing, spanning this gradient of conventional to regenerative management. So as part of this, we were looking at not only how does grazing interact with other management practices, but how is this delivery of some of these ecosystem services vary based on how they are located, so their geography. So whether or not they're further away from the coast, sort of their rainfall amounts, their soil type, et cetera. And when we're talking about ecosystem services, we generally think about ecosystem services as everything from sequestering carbon to promoting soil fertility, or things that are like provisioning services, such as meeting a fruit yield or the quality of that fruit. And then because we were working on commercial vineyards, it was really neat. Had the opportunity to look at the duration of management. So we had some vineyards that were, just in the beginning of, grazing, maybe just only have been grazing for 3 years. We had some that have been grazing for as many as 27 years. At the same time, we had vineyards that were established organic or regenerative, or some that were just beginning that transition stage. So we're able to look at this interaction of how does this affect these services over time. So a little bit of a quick clarification. So how did we define regenerative vineyards in the study? So we had a list of sort of 8 practices. And if a vineyard did 4 or more of those practices, they were defined as regenerative. And this is based on sort of previous research that we did, where we found that this is sort of grouping at least 4 of these practices allowed for sort of improvement of these ecosystem services. Excellent. So there is our study setup. So for our framework, what we did, we went out and we found neighboring vineyards. For these vineyards, they had the same row and vine spacing, similar rootstock and variety, and they're similar age. And it's pretty much these things and whether or not they had sheep grazing or not. But then at the same time, they're both along the gradient. So we had some vineyards with and without sheep grading that were kind of much more on the conventional side. And then we also had some that were much more on the regenerative or organic side as well, to allow us to really examine some of those interactions. For our sampling itself, what we did was in each vineyard, we established these 4 50-meter transects in which all of our sampling occurred upon. And then what we did was then we averaged those results for each of those transects at the farm level for our statistical analyses. And for our soil sampling, within a vineyard, you have even a good deal of spatial differences, even within one row. So you have sort of your middle of your row, the aisle, the tractor row, you have that margin between the aisle and the vine row. And so we did our sampling so that we captured each one of these areas. So we could kind of capture that sort of broad swath of the vineyard itself too. So this is just a table with, it's a big table, it's a lot to read, but this is everything that we collected data on. And so what you have on our far left column is our ecosystem service type. So you have your main kinds, so you're provisioning, you're regulating, and you're supporting. And then you have all those indicators that go into each one of those ecosystem services. So as you can see, we collected a lot of data. And then that's we're going to kind of talk about the results around all this data that we collected here as well coming up. Awesome. So what we're going to first talk about in that ecosystem service is carbon and nitrogen. Carbon and nitrogen are big. Nitrogen, one of your key nutrient components, and carbon is great, for building that essentially with soil organic matter and kind of serve as this foundation. And so we looked at, in terms of carbon and nitrogen, across 6 soil organic matter pools, the total soil organic carbon and nitrogen, as well as the mineral associated carbon and nitrogen, and the particulate carbon and nitrogen. The mineral associated carbon and nitrogen is generally that carbon nitrogen that's bound to those really small clay particles, and it's thought to be a little bit more stable. And that particulate pool is that kind of that fresher carbon and nitrogen, and it's a bit more, it gets cycled through more quickly, but a lot of times that particular carbon nitrogen ends up becoming your mineral associated carbon and nitrogen. So across these 6 soil organic matter pools, obviously where a vineyard is located and its soil type are very important, but what also is very significant is the management practices. And what popped out is across these 6 soil organic matter pools, when we averaged it, grazing livestock came out as being our most important approach that was kind of validated by 2 statistical methods. But you also see here is that there are also a lot of other, you see these kind of those bars is our confidence intervals, our variability. So you also see that a lot of these other practices are important as well too. So, grazing is key, but it's really also kind of in certain context dependence and where you're at, these other practices pop up. So, and that's really, it's really neat is that these practices, how important they are, it really kind of varies in terms of the different types of this carbon or nitrogen pool. So we'll kind of pop into that. So with regards to carbon, the overall soil organic matter pool, the most important practices are no-till in the tractor row, organic amendments, and permanent ground cover. For the mineral associated carbon pool, getting those organic amendments out there, and for the particulate organic carbon grazing sheep, avoiding herbicides, and again, some more permanent ground cover. But then we get into this nitrogen pool. So grazing pops out as being the most important practice for all the nitrogen pools. But then you also have other things popping up, like, avoiding synthetic insecticides, kind of repeatedly. You kind of see here this colembula pictured in the top. These colembula, they are these soil-dwelling insects. They play a big role in breaking down a lot of your small pieces of organic matter and playing a key role in that carbon and that nitrogen cycling and breaking it down and releasing that nitrogen for the plants. And you also see here, I have a picture of some sheep grazing around 50% veraison in August. And you can see in this vineyard, this year-round grazing facilitated this vineyard to move away from every other row tillage as well as avoiding herbicides. And so I'll kind of highlight this a little bit later, but how grazing is kind of this keystone practice, which facilitates and kind of has this cascading effects for allowing some of these other practices to work out. But the key and idea here is that it's not just about one practice. It's about stacking together some of these multiple practices. So on that note, we were like, okay, grazing seems to be very important. It's not just about one practice. So let's look at how does grazing interact with vineyards that are under regenerative management. So how does grazing interact on vineyards that are doing 4 or more sustainable practices versus those that are doing less? And then how does this happen over time? This is just saying that this model did very well in terms of predicting carbon and nitrogen accrual. But kind of sort of this key takeaway, which is really neat. So all of our vineyards in the study practice winter cover cropping. So we have a baseline carbon accrual happening in California vineyards. So this is like, I think speaks to how far along and kind of the impressive work that these Northern California vineyards have been doing. So we have a baseline accrual of soil organic carbon of 0.17 metric tons of soil organic carbon per hectare. But then we see improvements in this once we get regenerative or regenerative graze. But the key thing of looking at is like, where do we see a significant difference from this baseline accrual? And where we saw the significant difference is when we combine our grazing plus regenerative management, where we get a significant additional 0.38 metric tons of soil organic carbon per hectare. And so essentially, these accumulation rates are higher and less variable when we combine grazing with regenerative management, with grazing amplifying these soil organic carbon gains under regenerative management. But what's really neat, so when we move to nitrogen, what we see is grazing really pops out as, so before the carbon, you really needed to combine grazing with regenerative management to get these carbon gains. But with nitrogen, you're seeing nitrogen gains in both systems under conventional and regenerative management. What's really key here too is that when we're looking at within that nitrogen, that plant available nitrogen as well. So we're seeing, as we're building the soil organic matter over time, we're kind of building this bank for this much faster cycling nitrogen, which can be available to the plants. And these are, while somewhat small on a year-to-year basis, anywhere from about 1 kilogram of N per hectare per year over time, you really are, especially with kind with a cover crop, you're building up these plant available N gains, which can allow you to meet, potentially most of your fertility through a cover cropping and grazing program. So overall, yeah, grazing boosting N in conventional systems, but it's also happening across both regenerative and conventional systems. And the key kind of takeaways, with this is it really seems to be about some of our key practices are it's about grazing, reducing tillage, and having more permanent ground cover for building that soil organic matter. And we're talking about these soil organic carbon gains. These are real gains. They're sort of a UN threshold of the 1 per milli goal, and all these gains sort of exceed that goal for what we need to do to sequester carbon. And so that we're also, though, not only are we sequestering carbon, but we're also providing this kind of on-farm management of enhancing this plant available N. All right. So going a little over time, but right here, we're talking about how does grazing, all these other ecosystem services I talked about. So this is kind of a little bit of a confusing plot, but we have in red our conventional vineyards and blue our vineyards that we're transitioning to regenerative management, and green our regenerative management. And what we're seeing here is that as we move across this x-axis to the right, we're seeing sort of this improvement of all those ecosystem services that we were talking about. So I'm going to pull up this little picture here. So you can see those ecosystem services moving to the right are this reduction of synthetic inputs, sustaining soil community, carbon storage, nitrogen storage, soil fertility, erosion control, supporting plant biodiversity and forage quantity. So we kind of just go back as we're moving on to the right. It's really neat. We're seeing both grazing and regenerative management associated with improving sort of all those ecosystem services as we move to the right. And you really see this relationship with time with sort of those transition vineyards being right in the middle of that. And here's just sort of a summary of our sort of this delivery of these ecosystem services that we talked about in those previous graphs between the grazing in pink and the no grazing in black, and where you don't see an overlap in those shaded areas where we're really seeing these much stronger differences. What's really neat too, so we're seeing these improvements of all these soil and biodiversity ecosystem services, but we're seeing no trade-off in which we're seeing losses in yield or berry quality. While yield and berry quality are not moving along with these other ecosystem services, we're seeing no drop-off in them. So farms are still able to get these other services while not losing, their key berry qualities or yield metrics. So across all those ecosystem services, we took the average of them to come up with multifunctionality. And so what really pops up as being some of the most important things for this overall multifunctionality is livestock grazing. But we also see these kind of really large confidence intervals. So it really speaks to that there's all these other different practices are also important too. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? With livestock grazing, we also see no synthetic herbicides right behind it. So these different practices are correlated to one another. So when we do livestock grazing, we also see this drop in synthetic herbicides, and you get this overall enhancements in these multifunctionalities of these vineyards. Kind of part of this year too, we had this other little sub question where we were looking at grazing just during the winter, then vineyards that also do grazing in the winter, but because maybe they have a higher trellising system and then graze during the vine's growing season. And what we're seeing here, we're seeing our overall multifunctionality and the regenerative score on the bottom. So what we're seeing is as you go up that regenerative score, so from the higher regenerative score, it's seeing improved multifunctionality. But then we see these bars. So what we're seeing though is that when you have grazing on top of that, you significantly improve that multifunctionality. And what we do see the extended grazing above the dormant grazing. We didn't necessarily have enough of a sample to get a statistical difference, but what it does show is that folks were concerned if we're doing extended season grazing that we may see drop-offs in ecosystem. We may see like increased compaction or overgrazing, but we're really seeing that we're not getting any of that. And this does suggest the potentially for extended grazing to further enhance the ecosystem services in these systems. It's something that we need to kind of look into a bit more, but it's kind of an exciting result in which it seems like these vineyards can bring in grazing even more and potentially further improve their sustainability goals. And this is really to finish off, it's just how grazing really helps facilitate all these other types of practices. So we see our universal adoption of winter cover crops. We see our overall green cover at bud break. So we see grazing generally facilitating the ability for more vine to vine ground cover. We see much more permanent ground cover. So grazing allowing vineyards to have this permanent thatch, which has these benefits of heat resilience to these heat events during the summer, which allows for quality. We see a big drop off in these with grazing, like being able to move away from synthetic herbicides and herbicides, while at the same time, with very, very consistent sort of organic amendments between both, as well as kind of a trend towards grazing, allowing for moving away from tillage in the tractor row. So on that, I'm going to say thank you very much. This project was a giant collaboration between a lot of researchers, farms, vineyards, CAFF, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Tommy.
Yeah.
So we're going to take the final 10-12 minutes here to answer some questions. So I'll just pose the questions And if anyone wants to answer them, I know a lot of these, I will say a lot of the questions that I'm seeing are kind of like an it depends, at least from all of the interviewing that I did. So all this stuff is very particular to your site, your goals, what you're growing. I know there's some folks in here asking questions about crops aside from grapes. So first question is how do you limit the amount of weed seeds the sheep bring into the fields? We now have weeds we have never seen before after 2 years of winter sheep grazing. Anybody want to speak to that?
I've never heard that one before. But one thing you could do is, well, try to understand the weeds and what they're saying, because it might be, I think that particular shift might not be just about what seeds are present, but also do you have more or less bare soil that might be causing different conditions? And then functionally, I'd say if you can find a neighbor to partner with when you're bringing a flock, maybe the flock grazes their property is the first one in the neighborhood, and maybe they don't mind. So then all those seeds are worked out of the system by the time they get to the property.
Yeah, I think you got to look at, you might have a change in your actual soils that are causing a change in some of your weed spectrum that is, more advantageous for that specific weed. And if you have non-vineyard ground, like say your headlands or any woodlands that are here in the coastal areas, have them graze that first in an area that you can kind of document if you do see a change, and you're able to manage it in a different manner before they go into the vineyard. So
Great. Thanks, guys. So there are a lot of questions. If anyone on the panel wants to hop in, there's a lot of questions that are geared towards like specific management styles. And again, I think that's like going to be hard for us to nail down because everyone's going to do their own thing. One person is asking what breed of sheep is best. Does it matter?
Let's say that deer sheep have a little bit wider palate, and so they're yeah, a lot of times they'll do better with eating various forbs and weeds, and then also they'll do better with clearing dry forage if you're grazing later in the year in this dry Mediterranean climate. But functionally, a lot of times the answer is the sheep that you can get on your property are the best sheep, because a lot of times there aren't enough sheep available for everybody. So the difference isn't big enough that I would like let it scare you away. But just for the information, yeah, I'd say heritage sheep breeds like incorporate the Tatum, I think are the most effective.
yeah, I would agree with that assumption. Whatever you can get, you sometimes you can't be picky. But don't bring in goats on the low trellis system. You might see them chewing more on 1-year-old wood. Uh, you can bring them in or baby goats on high trellis systems that you can't be climbed. So yeah, there's not
Yeah.
much to add.
Um, Tommy, I was hoping you could help answer this one because we were unable to get anyone from Lange Twins to be here. But can you talk about year-round grazing and how that looks in California a little bit?
Yeah, there's kind of two different models. I think the main one and has kind of the most potential for moving forward is when vineyards have a trellis system that is extended, so it's high up, high enough that the sheep can't graze on the fruit. What happens here, at bud break, which in some cases is happening in some vineyards as early as right now, but generally happens around, mid-March or so. If you're in a lower trellises, you got to pull the sheep out right then. But you still have a lot of biomass growth actually most of the biomass growth happens from about mid-March through May. You still have moisture in the soil. And you also have the warming temperatures allowing for a lot of this growth. So you have a really key opportunity to get maybe another kind of big grazing event in. And so with these extended trellising systems, it allows you to come in and take advantage of that biomass, both for the sheep as well as a way to manage that understory vegetation. The other kind of version is that you do have some vineyards in which you have a lower trellising system. What they're doing is they're bringing the sheep in after the fruit has set, but before veraison. So when the berries are still green and they're really sour, and so the sheep will not eat the berries, but they're actually using the sheep for the specific tool of doing some leaf pooling. For actually canopy management to promote airflow as well as some undervine vegetation. That kind of takes a bit more sort of nuance and kind of and skill, and the sheep aren't out there as much. So the model for that second one is when the vineyards actually own their own sheep, because it's necessarily maybe bringing in a contract grazer for that may not make economic sense. But I think with these high trellising systems, you really provide this great opportunity to kind of get in there whenever sort of the weather or the climate best allows, for this biomass to be controlled. And, maybe potentially it also helps out some of these contract grazing operations as well too, by giving them some more flexibility. If there are extended grazing sites, they have maybe something to move to, and there's not sort of this big rush to kind of get the sheep in all at the same time and then all out at the same time as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. And I'll also just note that the Grazing Sheep in California Vineyards Best Management Practices
Yeah.
Guide that CAFF co-developed kind of speaks to the nuance of those a little bit more deeply, because they are kind of like specialized practices that aren't the general like grazing in the winter and early spring months. So feel free to check that out. And we will be publishing that in Spanish very soon as well. So able to share that with folks. Another question on here. Do you ever work with growers that are using or interested in using California native plants as perennial cover crop? Not so much.
I I couldn't answer off the top of my head. Um, yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't work on California natives.
I have heard that if you're gonna do California natives and gray sheep, do not have lupin,
Yes,
because my understanding is it's quite toxic to them.
yes.
Um, we've talked about trying to establish native grasses, but we haven't looked at like wildflowers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think this just again speaks to the importance of the communication streams between land managers and animal managers to make sure safety is being considered, and everyone is the sheep are not going to be harmed by anything that's in the field. So just another consideration to have.
Yeah, I think the one thing we didn't touch, like if an operation is using herbicides in their management practice, some of these herbicides do have grazing restrictions. So reading the labels, some are approved and some aren't. So look at those labels before bringing a sheep in. Because there is ruminant studies that have been done on certain herbicides and certain herbicides you shouldn't use. So just refer to the labels on those specific details.
Yes, definitely. And then Christian, one for you. I've heard from quite a few landowners who believe that grazers are in need of land or spaces to keep their sheep and therefore conclude that the service should be free or discounted, or that they should be paid for providing access to land for sheep and livestock. As the business model of contract grazing is evolving, what do you think is a good, quick response to this misconception? Or is there a potential truth in this and potential for local relationship building?
Yeah, I'd say I don't mind when I'm always happy to get the call if landowners, want to offer land that they don't have budget for, but would like it grazed. But in terms of expecting that, yeah, it's not really a problem because if they have that misconception that that's how it should go, then I wouldn't say I worry about people's misconceptions, because then there's other people to work with who are willing to pay. And so I just go work with them, and then usually people over time can solve their own misconceptions, I guess, when the kind of marketplace of the grazing shows them that it's kind of unrealistic. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a topic that just needs constant conversation, and it's up to the individuals that are involved to figure out how that contract is going to work out, right?
Well, I think there's one thing I know my parents saw that, they're generally graze their own ground. But then to go to contract grazing is your insurance cost to the operation was significantly higher. And that cost was an unexpected. So, there is a cost to people grazing, at liability, however you want to look at your overhead does increase.
All right, we've got like 2 minutes left. Just want to say, make sure that you registered for this class, I guess, or workshop. I guess you would have had to, just so that you get any follow-up emails I'm going to send out. Let's see. Are there any questions y'all are seeing that you want to answer? Some of them feel particular. Charlie
There was
mentioned.
on the tilling.
Hmm.
So we will till ground in the fall and that's based really more on worker safety. If say the ground becomes unsuitable for, employees or tractor passes, we will do a fall application and we'll work the ground before it gets wet, before we get in the winter rains. And that's more just due to employee safety and, ease of going through the field. We have adapted newer pieces of equipment and then machinery to, if we do need to come in season, that it doesn't work the ground. It vertically kind of tills, and you can till it to just only like 2 inches, and just to kind of help smooth it out, because in the end is what's health, safe for our humans that are going through, and the sheep, and trying to take that holistic view. So sometimes you do need to rework stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie.
A couple of the questions that you're kind of asking about, like the grazing rotation to the management. I would say that the way I plan a lot of projects that I'm working on is 200 sheep could be doing to be able to fully graze even thick cover crop, an acre a day. And in terms of like the health of the land and the health of the animals, you can always, if you're doing this kind of like electric fencing, rotational grazing, I'm always shooting for 2-day rotations, 48-hour pen. So, and that it's flexible. A lot of times it gets that third day, but yeah, in my experience, if you kind of going through are aiming everything for a 48-hour paddle, then you're going to be doing densely enough that it's going to be effective grazing. You'll also be moving along quick enough that it's not damaging things, and then also you're getting the animals away from site reproduction cycles in the main.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that it probably varies depending on site and the grazer that you're working with too. So just wanted to state that in general about like all the things that we're answering is like, this isn't just like a one answer kind of practice. It's very specific to each site and to the needs that you have. Well, we're at 11:01, so we made it past the hour. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to those who joined and threw in some questions to keep us on our toes. Yeah, and check out, I dropped into the chat the grazing guide and some other integrating livestock into different cropping systems, just because folks had some questions about that too. So CAFF does have some resources on those as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.